Welcome to Insight, a series exploring the deeper philosophies of renowned traditional martial artists, hosted by Ray Hughes, a martial artist with 50 years of experience.
Hey, welcome to the show. Today's guest is Sensei Rick Hobusch. I've known him for 50 years. He is my sensei. Give you the line of Osaka, Hobusch, Moore, and then me. Of course, we were all together, working together back in the day. But he is a really great martial artist. He started in the late 60s. He was a Wuko official back in the day, a very accomplished competitor, excellent teacher. Any of us that have trained for any length of time, you come across randomly those special people in the martial arts, those rock stars. They may not be famous or well known, but these are special people. Now, Rick is one of these guys. Very consistent. I've watched him. I've trained under him. He's always straightforward, ethical. We used to have really difficult philosophical discussions about the dark characters of those days in our organization and how I felt they weren't handled correctly from my perspective. And he would argue the other side. Never accepted the fact I was right, but so very, very consistent. As a competitor, as any of us that have competed at any length of time or number of times, you came across random competitors that were above you. They were in the next level. This was one of those guys. I remember watching him compete and just being stunned how solid and good he was. With that, we're going to start the show and welcome our new guest today, Rick Hobusch. Hey, welcome everybody to the show. Actually, this is probably about the 16th time that Sensei Hobusch and I have been trying to get this podcast off the ground. Luckily, we've had many years of martial art training, so we're not breaking equipment yet. Back in the old days, we'd probably be throwing our computers around, but now that we're old and wise, we're okay. So welcome to the show, Sensei. How you doing up there in Salt Lake
Thank you, Rick.
City?
Very glad to be here.
Okay. Well, let's get going, Sensei. I know you started back in the late 60s, so give us an overview of why and how you got started.
Yeah, basically, I was at a university and there was a karate class. It was Shotokan. And I started there. And of course, it was only that semester. And of course, I didn't even have a gi at that time. And when I came up back to Salt Lake City area, I didn't know of any Japanese dojos that were in existence. So I started with some Kaju Kembo for a while. But as soon as I went to the University of Utah, Sensei Toshio Osaka was there. And so I started with classes with him. And he invited me down to the dojo in Salt Lake City. And so I started training there. And from there, we continued and started doing some pretty good fighting with that particular program for sure.
Well, let me ask you this question. You know, joining martial arts, that's a big step. So before you started that one class with the Shotokan instructor, were you thinking of martial arts at that time, or you just happened to look across and see a class and wanted to join it?
I was thinking about, for sure, taking the karate classes because I was very interested in fighting. Because as a youth and an orphan youth, I had done quite a bit of fighting, and so I wanted to kind of perfect some skills or get some other information. I tried a little boxing. We had had a little group in Sandy where we had boxed under some direction and so forth, and so having to go into the karate program seemed a very smart thing to do. You know, and at that time I needed a little discipline as well.
Well, you know, this is a time, like I was talking to Sensei Maran, the Vietnam War is still going on this time. And I asked him if it had any effect on his decision. Did the Vietnam War have any effect on you as far as martial arts?
Oh, you're quite right. There were quite a few people from my high school that had been drafted over and had not come back. And so there was always at that time in our mind that we may have to do service. Fortunately for us, Marlon and myself, we had the lottery system that kind of changed
Right.
that. So we finally kind of got out of that particular obligation. But fighting and being able to protect yourself was definitely an issue because we thought we were all going to be warriors at that time.
Now you were an orphan. Did that experience affect you in one way or the other as far as moving you into the martial arts?
Yeah, it did gravely because, well, I'll give you an example. The moment I showed up at the university down in St. George, um, it was actually college at that time. There were some cowboys from the rodeo club that decided they were going to sheep shear my head. And so again, the continuation of having to fight on a weekly or daily basis started to come up again with the Cowboys. But I loved them dearly, and we became friends in the end. But it took a little push and shove, to say the least.
I don't know about you. I had gone through bullying experience when I was in school, and I always felt that that actually helped me become a better karate teacher. Do you think that was the same thing in your situation?
Yeah, you're quite right about that. The bullying situation was a big thing, especially when you're an orphan, especially with some older
Yeah,
boys in the neighborhood. And I found out there was actually 4 stages of this. When they first came up to you, it was all posturing and showing off for their friends that they were gonna intimidate you. And then the next thing, you had to decide whether you were gonna fight or flight, you know? Unfortunately, a lot of people I saw had the option of freezing, and that didn't seem to be much of an option for me. So what I learned from that was, soon as they started coming up and posturing, the game was on, so you might as well hit them then. And so when I started to hit them first, there became less and less chances for them to intimidate.
well, it's funny. I've had many men join the school who wanted to learn how to defend themselves, and I would be talking with most of these guys, older guys, and they had never been in a fight before. And I had thought, if I had never had to defend myself as with bullies, how could you teach? Because you've got to be able to teach a student what it's like. And that was the hard thing for me. Did you feel that in your teaching?
Yes, in the teaching, you're quite right. There were a lot of people, and usually the larger people had less experience about fighting because
Yes.
a lot of the bullies are cowards, and so they wouldn't pick on someone
Right.
they thought that could actually beat them. And so
Hmm.
it was very difficult getting them into the mindset of actually fighting. Fortunately, I
Right.
had a lot of stepbrothers and sisters, and it was an occasion since my earliest memory.
Well, going back to when you joined with Sensei Osaka, did he just get there? Was he fairly new in Salt Lake City at that time?
Yeah, he was. He had first, after leaving the University of Nishida, he'd gone to Hawaii to kind of get an
Right.
orientation to the American public. And there was a graduate from the University of Nishida that was there at the time. He was invited to Salt Lake by the Salt Lake Buddhist Church Judo Club. And there was a Reverend Watanabe there, was a good friend of his, and so that worked out. He soon left the Buddhist church and went to a YMCA, and he started teaching there. Soon after, he was able to establish a dojo. He moved into what was the Black Eagle Federation, and of course, then we turned it into JIKC, the Japanese
Right.
International Karate.
When you started, so you're one of the first group of black or students to join and start training with them, correct? You were that first group.
Yeah,
How
there
how
were
was
just
that training?
Yeah, the training was very interesting because Sensei Osaka came from a university karate program. And in that
Right.
program, it's kind of how they train is by survival. And so,
Right.
it's mostly fighting. There was not a lot of karate as far as kata. Actually, in Nichidai, they used to say, if you're actually good at kata, you must be bad at kumite, at fighting. Yeah. So, and that's not like a lot of the other universities or styles. They kind of put an equal emphasis. But at that time, the Wadoru program at Nichidai was very much focused on fighting and winning. So when he came here, he also wanted to have a good reputation with his school. There were quite a few Japanese instructors at that time, in the early 70s and so forth, with the
Right.
popularity of karate. But he didn't want to have just a regular school. He wanted to have a school that had a great reputation for fighters. Now, we had some other programs for kids and so forth, but the main emphasis with the adults was on a fighting program.
Doug Jefferson said that he came in after you, and he was talking about a lot of the dark characters at that time when he was there. Were there dark characters when you were there?
Extreme dark characters. We had guys who had been in prison and were on their way to prison. We also had university graduates and some very educated people, lawyers, doctors, and so forth. So there was kind of two feelings within the dojos, or two environments. Both of them were very much focused on fighting, but Sensei Osaka did not have students that were, cookie cutter type, where you would say, Sensei Osaka students are like this, other than that they could fight. And so what happened is, yes, we had some pretty dark characters that came into the dojo, that's for sure. And a lot of them, well, we have a couple of them that are still out there at the penitentiary.
It's funny. I think we talked about this before off air. I believe in the philosophy of martial art and being the best you can be, but I could also hang with the dark side. Were you like that back in those days?
Well, yeah, yes. What happened is, in order to kind of stay alive, you kind of had to understand that a lot of people had a different perspective than what you had. And in order to kind of survive and be with them, you kind of had to acknowledge their perspective of life and give them some respect and so forth. For example, we had one individual in our dojo. Doug mentioned Senpai Joe.
Yeah,
He was a
Crazy
little
Joe.
rougher, one of the characters. And after defeating him for the grand championship in 1981, he stood outside the dressing room with a 6-inch blade and was going to stab me because I had beat him in competition. However, having avoided that, I went to the dojo, bowed to him as my senior, and walked in, and it was all over. He was very worried about the disrespect that may be coming his way, and that was what the concern was about.
Now, during your color belt days, this is going into the early 70s, did you compete? Because that was before the Utah Open, right?
Oh, yeah, yes, yes. As I mentioned, with the Kaju Kembo group and so forth, that group did a lot of fighting. And it wasn't as powerful kicks and so forth, I thought at that time, but we did do a lot of fighting. And matter of fact, I went on a tour of Mexico with the group where we fought Mexican groups in Culiacan and in Mazatlan. And so we started doing a lot of inter-club kind of fighting, but it wasn't really any tournaments per se that I knew about until Sensei Osaka started. There was one that was sponsored here in Utah in 1969, where actually Bruce Lee was here. They had a big international competition at the Salt Palace. So you got to see a lot of the old names that were here in Salt Lake City at that time. But locally, the tournaments were not organized like they
Right.
did in 70, 71, 72. Then things really started with the tournaments. Mostly people were just watching Kung Fu on TV.
When did the Utah Open start? Were you a black belt then, or were you still a color belt?
I was still a brown belt in the first Utah Open. And that was a very interesting tournament. For example, we had 125 competitors in all. There was no referee, so all the senseis had to actually be the corner judges and referee. It was kind of interesting because Sensei Kurobani from Denver, I remember him saying, "This is impossible. How can we have a tournament if you have no officials?" But it worked out. And the guy who won it, by the way, was a Polynesian guy from Lima Lama from California at that time. Yeah.
Did were you've always been involved with the Utah Open. As long as I've known you, you've always been a big part of that organization. Did you start at that tournament helping out Sensei Osaka, or was that later on when you got involved?
Uh, in the first one, no, because I had just joined the university, private classes with him and all of that. But the second one, for sure. Everyone that was in the club sold tickets. We each received 10 tickets in order to give to other students to sell and to their
Mm.
parents and that type of thing. But I started helping him organize, make sure things were in place for the tournament, the elimination brackets and that type of thing. So, yeah, I was always one on the administration for the tournament as well.
Going to college and, you end up graduating and starting your physical therapy business, which was very, very successful. You've always been an ethical guy that I've known from day one. You've been consistent. How did you have an internal struggle with ethics and running situations and what you were seeing in the dojo with the dark characters?
Yeah, yeah. There was some we talked about before some contact rules that were a little light at times as far as
Mm,
regulation. Basically, Sensei put out that the senior student should go only as hard as the lower rank that he was free sparring with. The problem with that was now he was being challenged. And sometimes they
mm,
took that challenge a little seriously. And because some of the people who were coming in, as we mentioned, were not necessarily ethical and would actually try to take out one of the black belts. And so things escalated quite fast. So there were a few people with less ethics that were just trying to knock out the lower belt as he was coming up. I remember one of them telling me, well, if I cut him, then he'll be like a whipped dog and won't be able to challenge me later. So there became that type of thing. But my theory about that was to, try to win without actually hurting them, to actually
mm.
have them throw their techniques and learn which techniques they were going to use so that when I come up in competition with them, it was easy for me to already understand the game that I was in with them.
The tactics. So you're going through, as you're a color belt, are you in college at that time during your color belt days? You're going to school
Yes.
at that time, right?
Yeah,
And then you
that's
become
correct.
a black belt. You become a black belt, and then you open a second school up there. Did Osaka Sensei come up to you and say, open up a school, or how did that come about?
Well, it was kind of interesting in Salt Lake because with the popularity of karate, in the late 60s,
Mhm,
early 70s, and with the martial arts shows starting up and, the movies with Bruce Lee and that type of thing, things
mhm,
grew quickly. But also the competition. Now, our Senpai Joe would actually have to sit out in front of the dojo on a chair playing his bongos because other groups, it was more like gang warfare back then because you never know when they were going to storm your dojo, tear it apart,
mm.
or start fighting the beginners class, that type of thing. And so there became kind of a rough nature of the different martial arts groups in Salt Lake. So what happened since they wanted to expand? So he had actually asked me to start a branch school to increase the number of people that we had within the organization. And as a feeder program, as they got up to brown belt, black belt, to the main Hombu dojo.
Right, right. So when you started the school, obviously, because that's when Marlon started, when you opened up
Yes.
that school. And for those people out there, that was my sensei. Marlon says your teaching style and technique was quite a bit different than the Sugar House, Osaka's dojo. Why was that? How did that come about?
Well, the situation is I thought everybody had a chance to learn. Even some of the more athletic ones, it wasn't fair to actually punish them severely with a beating in order to train them. That became a little bit of the attitude at the Sugar House Dojo. I remember one time when a 15-year-old boy went up there as a brown belt, he came back with a broken orbit in his eye
Mm.
because one of the senior black belts out there, the first thing he did is punch and broke the kid's face. That
Mm.
kind of thing was ridiculous. So at what we had is the Granger Dojo. I had quite a few different I had junior high school kids, people who were coming in after work. We had 4 classes of adults, and then, of course, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we had the kids program, and we had 2 large, kids programs. So it went up. So my idea about training with them was we actually did for free sparring, for example, I didn't wanna use the word play because it was very
Mm.
deliberate freeze farm, but it wasn't 100%. It was like 50%. It was so that you could actually play fight, but kind of work up to the intensity, but have a dojo stablemate that you could trust in order to gain more and more skill. And so that became an important aspect for me. And I really thought that the important part about karate was not only to build skill, self-defense, sport, but also to build character, and not the kind of character that we saw from the other darker side of the dojo, of course.
Did you think at that time, I think the way I understood you is that that whole population of martial arts schools in those days were all pretty much the same as far as dark and not ethical? Do you think that was, like, across the board or just select schools?
No, no, the situation is within another organization. There was some great people that I became great friends with, but they also had their darker side population that would, try to find lone students out there and gang up on them and that type of thing. But in all of the schools, they had some tremendous people, some people that I had great admiration
Right.
for, and I'm still friends with to this day.
You know, I wonder if a lot of this comes from the Japanese because in Japan, in those early days, karate was not a very high level martial art. Would you agree with that? It was considered a
Uh,
low level martial art.
yeah, you're quite right. A higher level, of course, at that time was kendo in
Yes.
Japan. And so most of, the professors, the politicians' sons, and so forth were guided more into that particular sport because it seemed to have a lot more reputation to it. Judo came in, and most of them were required to take judo and kendo, but not necessarily
Mhm.
karate. That was more of clubs that were set aside.
Do you think because the karate was on a lower level and the Japanese arts, did it bring in more seedy people? Do you think what happened maybe?
It's kind of interesting because when Funakoshi went to Japan, he tried not to enter into Japanese society at a lower level. So, as you
Right,
know, he went directly to the universities first.
right.
And but however, just like in every society, there became people who really were mostly from the street and lower parts of the society. And so they also, clear back then, had their different levels of people within society. However, the karate people like to pressure test their skills. And so there
Yes.
was quite a few matches, official and unofficial, I understand. Yeah.
Because, from my perspective, and I could be completely wrong, when I was a color belt and when I got into karate, I became a fanatic. I was reading every book and the history and philosophy, and I'm looking around and I'm just not seeing it. It just seemed like most of the teachers in that time, Japanese and that first generation American instructors, seemed very arrogant. I don't know if I perceived just stature as arrogance or were they really arrogant. What did you think?
Well, as you know, within the martial arts, and therefore being martial, there is a hierarchical situation there. An
Right.
organization where you have kohai, senpai, and senseis, and then shihan. So there's kind of that organized stratification anyway, where you have to give due respect up. And it is true that most of the people who came to the United States to teach, his question whether they were at a sensei level. Most of them were
Right.
just young 21-year-old
Right.
kids coming over after
Right.
graduating from university. And that became a little bit different later with JKA. They had
Right.
actually an educational college for their instructors and so forth. But most of the other styles, what had happened is they were on their own. They were self-sponsored. They weren't sponsored by any organization and so forth. And as you know, within that society, they had quite a difference between generations. Although, if you take Sensei Suzuki, Sensei Osaka, and Sensei Takahashi, they're definitely different generations with different idea about the martial arts and so forth. It was amazing with Sensei Suzuki and Sensei Arakawa. It was obvious that they were Yamato Damashi. They were the old Japanese spirit and so forth, that you saw there in 1938, 39, and so forth, very
Right.
strong and so forth. And they were young men during World War II, where Sensei
Right.
Osaka, of course, he was a boy working at the USPX during occupation. And of course, Sensei Takahashi was not involved in any of that type situation. So it was kind of interesting looking at their thoughts of structure, discipline, and so forth. And part of that became with a confidence or arrogance that made them feel somewhat superior to the people they were teaching
Right.
because they were lower on the scale of the hierarchy.
Hey, thank you for joining the show with our discussion with Sensei Rick Hobusch. Part 2 of our discussion will be out in a couple of weeks, and he will continue his thoughts and perspectives of martial arts back in that day, in that period, that little slice of time when the Japanese had come into the United States to teach, and that first line of American students started training with them. And he'll continue that conversation. Until then, take care. We'll see you at the next show.